Okay, folks, I'm getting to start. Thanks for having me back. I'm Chris Henry. I'm the only grad student here, 98 to 2000, and after that I got to do my first adjunct teaching experiences. Since then I moved on to Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I'm going to tell you about a project I did last year while I was on leave from teaching. And I'm not going to blow your mind with any theoretical synthesis like Jim, or take you deep inside the human experience like Will did earlier. This is a kind of a light and breezy presentation on kind of a fun project I did last year. And it actually starts with a story in Chris Anstutz's Foundations of Humanistic Psychology class around 1999. And so to kind of set up how humanistic psych has been portrayed in textbooks, he brought his textbook from undergrad at Kent State, right? And so in the section on psychoanalysis, it has a picture that looks kind of like this, like a classic image of Freud. For behaviorism, an image that looks something like this, Skinner at work with the Skinner box. For humanistic psychology, what do you think? Maslow, Rogers, May, any guesses? A group of naked people hugging. All right. That's the biggest laugh I'm going to get today. And that was what it was like to be in the room, to just marvel at that. And that really stuck with me over the years. So when I had an opportunity to do kind of a smaller, fun project, I wanted to look at how humanistic psych is portrayed in introductory texts today. And really, Scott Churchill did a similar thing in 1988, and if you're familiar with that study, it's not really that different. There are a few differences. But Churchill looked at 13 books that had been published very recently at the time, and this was the only study I could find of intro texts. People looked at abnormal psych texts or history of psych texts. But I teach a lot of intro psych, so I use a lot of intro psych textbooks. So I wanted to look at those, and I found 21 that were published in the last 3 years. And fortunately, I was able to get this published in the newest edition of the Humanistic Psychologist. So if you want to see more of the nuts and bolts of how I put it together, it's there. But just starting with some general observations, there is some good news. Now, there's not a lot, but there is some good news. And that's that there is representation in all texts. And the majority of them have some positive aspects. So historical significance, challenging psychoanalysis and behaviorism, contributions to research and theory, things like motivation, personality, and therapy, and practical applications like counseling, education, group dynamics, and so on. But what I'm going to focus on today are some of the areas of concerns that we might have if we want accurate representation in those textbooks. So the first thing I found was that the coverage, while universal, is very, very limited, and it's limited in at least 3 major ways. Compared to the field as a whole, I only found about a little under 6 pages per text, and you know how big these textbooks are. So that came out to just under 1%. So just under 1% of the total page count of a typical intro text is devoted to humanistic psychology. Even in what is included, it's limited almost exclusively to the areas that I mentioned a minute ago. So there is coverage in the intro chapters for the historical aspect, but then it's pretty much all motivation, personality, and therapy. The other big way that it's limited is it's about 98% Maslow and Rogers. Right? There's hardly any other discussions. Even in 1988, Scott Churchill could find references to other humanistic psychologists at the time. Very, very little in either humanistic, existential, or phenomenological areas. And if you're looking for transpersonal, don't bother, because I did electronic searches of all 21 textbooks, and there were no results found. So pretty much nothing there. Okay. So I'm just going to focus on the little bit that is included and some of the things I noticed there. This is a further breakdown if anybody's interested. You notice less than half, or about half a page in introduction sections. Once you get outside of the big 4 areas, the biggest areas get about a little less than a quarter of a page, until you get down to things where you get like less than 5% of textbooks providing coverage in those areas. And the presentations, the first thing I noticed in looking at the definitions of humanistic psychology was that they were really kind of all over the place. And so this was just sort of a list, all things that I kind of associate with humanistic psychology, but there was so much variance and inconsistency in the definitions. I wasn't sure what students would make of this. And my personal favorite was one that talked about feelings and yearnings, which, okay, that fits, but that's a little strange to put in a textbook definition, along with nonverbal experiences and altered states of consciousness. Again, all kind of pieces of the humanistic psychology I know, but I'm kind of wondering what a freshman student would make of this. But beyond those sort of impressionistic presentations, there were some key ideas that were presented in ways I felt were problematic. So for Maslow, while the hierarchy of needs gets universal coverage, the coverage is extremely rigid. In fact, almost every textbook has some version of this quote: you have to fulfill one level before you can move to the next, as if there's absolutely no nuance at all. I call this the video game version of Maslow to my students, right? You can't get to the second level until you beat the first level, right? So I have to explain that before I can go any further. So little nuance, and also very little in the way of advanced concepts, even not so advanced concepts like deficiency versus growth motivation, and very little on his later edition of self-transcendence as the pinnacle of the model. Rogers fared a little bit better overall, but there were a few concepts that seemed to be treated a little carelessly at times. So for instance, unconditional positive regard, as you might guess, was subject to some misrepresentation, such as this quote that defined it as constantly praising, boosting self-esteem, and withholding criticism. And there were a number that kind of had this sort of flavor to them. With discussions of reflection and mirroring, the quote I'm about to show you is almost the punchline to a bad joke. Most often there's nothing that the therapist says that the client hasn't already said. Okay? So basically a trained parrot to do this. Okay? And my favorite, possibly of them all, in one description of many descriptions of non-directive therapy, really portrayed it as passive. And this is probably my favorite. Thank you. You may be wondering exactly what the therapist does during sessions. All right. So, I also wanted to look at critiques of the humanistic approach, okay? And apparently I've already burned up 10 minutes, so I'm going to have to kind of skip ahead to some of the things I wanted to talk about, like the use of methods that were described as more like biographers than scientists, or that Maslow's research was just impressions of personal heroes. One text did mention the human science alternative, all right? But this is what it said. It immediately dismissed it by saying, science is science regardless of the phenomena being studied. That was it. Okay. Now on the theory side, what I really wanted to talk about was the optimism, or perceived optimism, of humanistic psychology. So there were lots of quotes that would basically say it doesn't encourage realism about evil, but discussions of positive psychology tended to say it's just balancing the scales, focusing on strengths rather than flaws. And sometimes this occurred even with the same authors. So these authors, in describing humanistic, said it almost completely ignores the negative aspects of human nature. But positive psychology does not deny these, it just directs the spotlight elsewhere. So there seemed to be kind of a double standard in that portrayal. Now, on the implicit side, things that sort of came out between the lines, the historical relic piece. So there were lots of references to contemporary rebelliousness, troubled times, counterculture, free love, and one author deserves an entire slide, one set of authors all to themselves, because after stating that humanistic matches the zeitgeist of the 60s, they then referred to flower children. They then referred to reaching full potential with a little help from your friends, and their photo was not naked people hugging, but it was a Woodstock. Okay. And the other thing I want to talk about in terms of an implicit critique was this sort of suspicion that this might not really be psychology at all. Maybe it's more philosophy, maybe it's more a cultural movement or a spiritual movement, kind of lumped in with trends that may have influenced some psychologists but are not actually distinctive branches of the field. And this quote really drove it home that it was a, quote, doctrine that has never been totally accepted by mainstream psychology. So now I'm winding down on time here. I basically just wanted to say my thinking on this in terms of beyond just sort of the humor of some of the quotes is, if you want to stay vital as a field, you got to attract new practitioners. Well, how do they become aware of your field? And most of those will take introductory psych courses and read the sorts of textbooks with problematic presentations that I've talked about. So the question I'll leave you with is, what do we want to do about that? Should we seek stronger representation? This kind of goes to some of the questions about where humanistic psych is going in the 21st century. And I think I might be just out of time. Okay. All right, thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, I think, as Scott answered that last question too, I would agree the answer is yes, definitely. On the other hand, could you pull up that slide from my old book? Because I'll give you part 2 of the story there.
Yeah, just a second.
So, these were freshman students at Penn State, and they got this book, and the intro chapter lists all these different approaches. There was a couple of others, a guy with wires in his head for the neuroscience thing, right? And pretty much every student that commented on this first chapter came up, pointed to the picture of the naked people, and said, "Could we learn more about this approach?" That's the one that spoke to them.
Yeah. And by the way, Chris scanned these pictures for me this morning. I had sort of found what I thought were close to that, but he found me the real pictures. Happy to take any other questions or comments.
But
Yeah.
is that the problem?
Hmm?
Is that picture the problem of humanistic psychology is not taken serious?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. They were rendering it as a pseudoscience.
Yeah.
Right. I saw a hand
I'm sorry.
Well, and to take it from the perspective of a human science,
Yeah.
the same things that the natural science model or paradigm critiques, are actually some fairly laudable goals. What's wrong with being happy or feeling good, or this? It's almost as though there's an expectation of this maudlin attitude that we must have, and it seems sad that the cultural overlay suggests that there's something wrong with those virtues in and of themselves anyway.
Yeah.
And so I that's one of the things that's problematic. It's not just what they're saying, it's the inference that is somewhere wrong.
Although in the contrasting coverage with positive psychology, I
That-
didn't have
that-
time for those, but there were quotes
Yeah.
that would say, positive psychology has a better appreciation
Right,
for
but
a scientific approach to understanding these
Sure,
things.
I mean,
Yeah.
and,
I don't,
So do you think the lack of representation, would you call it a failure or a lack of interest on our part?
on the part of
Part of
humanistic
humanistic
psychology, I do think there's the possibility that we've kind of written off the mainstream as just not being interested in us or worth our time to pursue kind of dialogue with. You know, I wonder who's responsible for making the changes, and as much as I would like to say, well, it's the authors, right, if they have a bias or a blind side, but, you know, I've never written an intro psych textbook. I don't know what it's like to pretend to be an expert on 500 topics. So I do think if there's going to be any change, it probably, the field, the humanistic field, may have to take a greater interest in pursuing that.
I mean, I can tell you I wrote a chapter for an encyclopedia on
Mhm.
theories, and they asked me to write an area that I had absolutely, after I did the area I knew something about, they then
Yeah.
asked me to write about two
Right,
other
right.
areas I knew
Yeah.
absolutely nothing about.
I notice everyone who talks about the hierarchy of needs cites Maslow 1943. I don't think a single one of them has ever read it because, you know, it just seemed to be totally lacking in meaning. I think a lot of it is repeating what you learned in your intro textbook. I think there's a lot of that repetition.
Yeah, and thanks for your I enjoyed your talk. This is more disturbing because I know a little bit about this intro stuff. If you look at the you don't just write it. There's like a team. There's usually like 70, 100 people that actually have input. If you look at, it's like people from universities all across the world that chime in and sign off on things and things like that. So it's not, it's not just one author.
Yeah.
It's like this is a lot of people that are involved in the production of the text, and that they all think that.
Yeah, it's surprising not to get notes from reviewers that say, you know, that's a kind of a stereotypical presentation.
I wonder, there's clearly bias on their side. I wonder, is there anything that they're seeing in humanistic psychology that's accurate?
I do think presentations of Rogers were fairly decent on the whole. There were some problematic ones that I focused on. I really felt Maslow got a much worse representation just from my perspective. But beyond that, there's the fact that think of all the other humanistic existential phenomenological psychologies who got no representation, you know, so there's not even a question of accuracy there. There was nothing for me really to analyze. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think we should recruit our elders in the tradition to write a textbook from the perspective of humanistic psychology and really include the history into it. And we can, as an organization, or, you know, can really get together and just invite the elders and the founders that are still around or as close to that to get together and just make that story. It could be a video story. It could be a video. You know,
There was
it could be
Yeah, was it Howard?
There was one there.
In the 80s.
There's a new one?
There's a new one.
What's the new one? Oh, the one you're working on right now. Okay, okay.
Ah.
Which I need to see.
like
But who was the guy at UT?
Yeah, it's UT, right.
Yeah, yeah.
Polio.
Howard
Right,
Polio.
that was a
Yeah,
good
he
one.
did one,
That
but
was a
that's
good one.
quite a while back.
Jim Burrell had done a good one.
Okay.
Patrick Whitehead, one of our doctoral graduates, has one out. That's a good one.
And Mark, do you want to speak to what you've just done?
He's there.
Yeah, and on absolute melodic
Speak up.
self-production.
Yeah, please speak up.
I got a grant from Affordable Learning Georgia to write an intro textbook that's free, open educational research, and it has a 60-page chapter on psychoanalysis and an 80-page chapter on humanistic existential transpersonal psychology. I was comforted by your slides that it manages to redress pretty much everything you mentioned. If any of you is interested, I'd be happy to provide the link. I can't get students to read it, but it's really good. And it's free.
Am I on? Okay. Anybody else have a question or comment? I can give them a little bit
I
more
could
time.
just give a little comment because I'm not a genuine humanistic psychologist.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I've been accused of that.
Okay, I do language psychology, and thinking of that, how you see language represented in any books in psychology, it's almost not there, or only as a cognitive
Yeah.
stuff.
Right,
You know,
right,
I really
right.
say
It's a
stuff.
subsection of cognitive.
And but I was thinking of, so I could do the same as you, and we could do the back side of the moon, the dark side of the moon, by having a textbook on all these not said, right?
Okay.
Language as the in-between of people, Vygotsky beyond the ZPD, humanistic psychology, etc. That would be so nice to have, because, and this is what makes science, it's a construction of a big one voice in these textbooks, and this is, it's also disquieting somehow, because it's not only a propaganda to the undergraduates, it's to ourselves.
Yeah, I just want to throw in one example I couldn't use here because it was an abnormal psych textbook, but it described humanistic psychology as anti-scientific and possibly even anti-intellectual.
Yeah.
That was the exact
Yeah.
phrase, right? Anti-intellectual? Yes.
I wondered to follow up on Jim's comment, because I thought you were asking, does the tradition see anything correctly about our shadow side?
Yes.
But because, how are they right? And what can we learn from that?
In the sense that the portrayals are accurate, or that the criticisms may have
They're-
some...
Well, they're seeing something.
That's
Yeah, yeah.
important for us to
Oh, I
understand.
see. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the sort of association with the 60s, it makes a certain sense if you're presenting that to a group of people to say, you know, look at the socio-historical context in which it sort of blossomed, but it seems to be reduced to that in the texts. And that is then used as a reason to say, so it's not really that vital or significant today. Like, it had its day, but that was a long time ago. Yeah.
Chris, I'm sorry I missed you at the beginning part of your presentation. We were still hung up over at a restaurant. But I have read your article. It's a very good one.
Thank you.
And something else that just kind of comes to mind, and you alluded to this a few minutes ago, is what I would refer to as the telephone game in psychology. When you're talking about Maslow and the needs hierarchy in 1943, and that just keeps getting recycled over and over and over again. But his later writings, where he really greatly enhanced upon that theory that he originally put out in a very, very brief form, all of that gets lost. Oftentimes, what Maslow, and especially with Maslow, what he did say is oftentimes misportrayed as what he didn't say, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And I think really the great kind of take-home message here is the value, and just thinking back on my West Georgia experience of reading original texts,
absolutely.
primary source texts, and not just going with tertiary and secondary sources all the time.
Yeah.
So I just want to throw that in.
How are we doing?
I mean, it's over, but.
Anyway, I actually love it. It's great. I think it's, even in humanistic, it kind of,
He's building good karma.
Right? And if you read it, you would see a lot of nuance, a lot of qualifications. Yeah, exactly.
Fun to be the time.
Okay. All right.